Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer 40k lore. Sorry for the voice, I'm still a little bit, woozy, but I figured it was time to get back to making lore videos. And today we are going to be talking about yet another Cursed Founding chapter. We are almost done with the Cursed Founding, but a couple rather obvious examples remain, one of them being the Firehawks. This chapter really is the poster child for, well, everything that is wrong with the 21st Founding, which is, saying fucking something considering the people we have seen so far. The Lamenters, the Black Dragons, and yet these guys are probably the worst of all. And who do they hail from? The Ultra Smurfs, of course. Or, well, to be entirely fair, the Firehawks themselves claim to be descendant from the Ultra Smurfs. The Ultramarines themselves vehemently deny any connection whatsoever to the Firehawks. Personally, if the Ultramarines tell me to not believe something, I'm going to believe that thing twice as much, so as far as I'm concerned, they are officially an Ultramarine successor chapter. Though to be entirely fair to the Ultra Smurfs, there are relatively considerable evidence suggesting that they might not actually be an Ultramarine successor chapter. They lack, for example, the usual adherence to the Codex Astartes. They are considerably more bellicose than your average Ultramarine successors. In fact, their rather unique take on most things doesn't really go that well with pretty much any loyalist chapter, really. They are very, very aggressive, exceedingly prideful, and put a great deal of stock in inter-chapter rank and internal privileges and standing within the chapter. Honor duels, for example, were very, very, very commonplace. They would also have a charming little tradition where both parties would take their chosen weapons and put them over a super hot brazier for about half an hour until it was essentially glowing hot, and then they would begin swinging said weapons at each other. A charming tradition, to put it rather bluntly, that would guarantee that the loser would at the very least be horrifically scarred, and in many cases be horrifically dead. And yes, indeed, honor duels to the death was not particularly uncommon, because as I said, they were extremely picky about their internal power structure and the pecking order within the chapter. This resulted in a ridiculously wide range of ranks: Captain-at-Arms, Knight, Sergeant, Brother Ensign, Brother First Class, Brother Second Class, so on and so on and so on. Most of these titles had, in all due likelihood, very little impact upon battlefield operations. A Brother Ensign might not be any higher, technically speaking, than a Battle Brother. However, within the chapter's complex system of honor, rights, and various ranks, he would be considered to be more important. A chapter like this would undoubtedly have all manners of secret rituals and all kinds of special little Nancy dance doodahs. For example, they would sit down around a table in a specific order, perhaps, or they would speak in a particular order, and mayhaps there is a rank that specifically circumvents certain regulations. For example, a Battle Brother would not be able to talk before a Sergeant unless he had a particular honorary title. I don't know, Battle Brother of blah 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 or something. Basically, what I'm getting at is that the Firehawks had an incredibly complex internal chapter structure, which does not suggest Ultramarine at all. It might suggest Dark Angel, perhaps, or maybe Iron Hands, but certainly not Ultramarines. If anything, to be entirely honest, I am halfway tempted to suggest that that sounds more like Emperor's Children. This theory is further backed up by the fact that the chapter had an incredibly high opinion of itself, even by Adeptus Astartes standards. Now, bear in mind, an Astartes Battle Brother will rightfully so, many would argue, consider himself to be far more important than, well, pretty much anyone else. A Space Marine will happily sacrifice 1,000 Imperial Guardsmen for him to get into the correct position to execute his mission, because his mission is almost certainly far more important than that of the 1,000 Imperial Guardsmen. However, most chapters still have a fairly somber view of their own position within the Imperium. They might be more important than guardsmen, or indeed civilians, but they are most definitively not more important than the Imperium as a whole. The Firehawks, however, appear to be of the opinion that they, and they alone, should be the arbiters of what is in the Imperium's interest and what is not. They have on several occasions simply just flat out refused deployment orders because they feel that the deployment that they are ordered to assume is simply not important enough. It is not worthy of them, the Firehawks. They should only be employed in the most pressing of circumstances, and considering the fact that the galaxy is more or less always on fucking fire, pressing circumstances are not exactly uncommon. A brilliant example of this would be their actions during the Age of Apostasy. At this point in time, the Firehawks would be a relatively new chapter. As such, it would not have built up a long-standing history of honors and various other privileges like other long-standing chapters. They would be considered the new guys on the block. And the vast majority of Space Marine chapters during the Age of Apostasy considered the internecine warfare between the High Lords of the Adeptus Terra and the Ecclesiarchy to be below them. They were worried about getting involved at all, fearing that they would be dragged down into the muck, so to say, if they sided with one side or the other, because on one hand, you had the filthy bureaucrats in the Adeptus Administratum. On the other hand, you had the self-righteous cunts in the Ecclesiarchy. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. And as such, most Adeptus Astartes forces focused on more local concerns, protecting their own backyard, and carrying out wars against Xeno species and Chaos worshippers, rather than getting involved with the internecine warfare within the Imperium. The Firehawks, however, showing once again their ability to be exceedingly arrogant, knew immediately who was right and who was wrong in what was, to be honest, a fairly complicated civil war. And so they immediately sided with the revolutionary reformer Sebastian Thor. Luckily for the Firehawks, this would turn out to be the correct side of history. And they would remain rather staunch allies of the status quo that appeared after the defeat of High Lord Gog Vandir and the reforms instituted by Sebastian Thor. They would in particular find themselves to be rather fierce opponents of anything that even remotely looked like a resurgent of the High Lord Gog Vandir. And they considered their highest calling to be fighting against renegade planetary governors, apostates, rogue lord militants, stuff like that. Internal struggles within the Imperium kind of became their bread and butter. They considered the whole Xenos warfare to be, interesting and all, but less severe, and it's hard to entirely argue against that. The primary threat against the Imperium has, and pretty much will always probably be, internal schism. It certainly has its external threats as well, but chaos and various renegade elements within the Imperium is almost always one of the largest threats to the Imperium as a whole. Because, of course, even the most minor of Xenos infestations can be made considerably more dangerous if the local planetary governors decide to simply just live and let live. A silly notion, to put it rather mildly. And as one might suspect from a chapter that seems so, deeply puritanical, shall we say, they have of course developed quite a liking for the Imperial cult, and even by Astartes standards they are pretty damn zealous, which is another one of the reasons why they consider themselves to be so goddamn special. They are, like all Astartes chapters, of course, the Emperor's angels, but they are something more. The Firehawks are quite literally the Emperor's chosen, which is another good reason why they simply cannot be wasted on silly little things like clearing out Tyranid infestations or roaming orc warbands. They have to deal with the important stuff, like the ideological and religious purity of the Imperium, for example. And said religious streak also is represented rather clearly in their battle doctrine. The Firehawks are of the opinion that if they are actually deployed against an enemy, then that must mean that the enemy is, well, pure evil, to put it rather bluntly. They have to be the absolute worst thing ever, literally Satan, in every single conceivable meaning of the word. As such, when they actually are deployed and take to the field, they do so with extreme prejudice. The Firehawks are very, very fond of, annihilation actions. Indeed, I expect the words of their then Grandmaster Stibor Lazarek to very, very succinctly sum up their position. Quoting, "Burn them all. The God Emperor will know his own." End quote. Yes, they're that kind of religious fanatic. They are entirely convinced that they can do no wrong, because after all, even if they were to happen to burn a few million civilians to death, so what? They would be leaving this world and rejoining the Emperor in quote-unquote heaven. I mean, in all due honesty, the civilians should be thanking the Firehawks for liberating them from their earthly toils and sending them up to the Emperor's side. Now, of course, aforementioned civilian population, which is currently burning to death very, very slowly inside of their homes, like so many pigs in a blanket. Severely underestimated dish, by the way. Absolutely delicious if done correctly. Oh, and just to specify, I am speaking about the sausages baked inside their buns now, not the civilian population, you know. Just to clarify, because I have no idea what civilian tastes like, but I'm almost certain it's not anywhere near as good as pigs in a blanket. But yes, aforementioned civilian population currently burning to death might disagree on the finer points of principle with the Firehawks, and potentially there might be some religious debate, which, well, would be occurring if they weren't, again, burning to death, but this is a minor issue at best, because, well, civilian population. There are a lot of civilians within the Imperium, but only at most a little over 1,000 Firehawks, so clearly one is much, much more valuable than the other. It will almost certainly not surprise you to know that the Inquisition are quite fond of the Firehawks, or at the very least the more extreme elements of the Inquisition are quite fond of the Firehawks. There are also quite a lot of inquisitorial agents that are less fond of them, because the Firehawks have a nasty habit of taking justice into their own two power-armored hands. Now, of course, you might immediately be tempted to point out the hypocrisies of the Inquisition, accusing anybody else of overreaching their remits, but I would suggest you don't, because while the Emperor's Inquisition have virtually limitless patience, they are also possessed of a hair trigger, so we shall return to safer grounds, namely the Firehawks and their penchants for burning people to death en masse. The best example of which being the Great Malagatine Purge of 770 to 79 Millennia 38. This was an Imperial military operation carried out by 5 Space Marine chapters, however we only know the names of 3 of them, as all records of the operation has been stricken or highly classified in Imperial records. The chapters we know of are the Firehawks, the Silver Skulls, and the Charnel Guard. And when I said that any information about this purge was top secret, I really do mean it. This is one of those operations so nasty that even the Inquisition does not by default have access to the records pertaining to it. Now, of course, an inquisitorial lord might request and will probably be granted access to said documents, but even that is not guaranteed. The few scraps of information we have pertaining to the action states that the High Lords of Terra decreed that the campaign should spare none and set a bloody, fearful example to the realm of mankind. The entire sector was to be cleansed of heretics. Now, the problem is that the Malagatine sector was never entirely confirmed to have, well, fallen in its entirety. This is one of those strange things, once again. Now, of course, 5 Space Marine chapters is a considerable force of Adeptus Astartes, but is it enough to take on an entire sector? Now, perhaps it is. If the sector has recently fallen to a chaos incursion, for example, it will be disunited. There will be very little overall leadership, and they will be poorly armored, and organized. However, such a thing would be a relatively small threat to the Imperium as a whole, and could probably be subjugated by Imperial Guard forces over the course of the next 50 to 100 years, which might sound like a long time, but everything considered, that's a relatively rapid campaign. However, if the sector had fallen due to large-scale chaos influence from an external source, e.g. a chaos crusading force, for example, which might include thousands of chaos space marines, possibly demons, etc., then 5 chapters might sound like a somewhat small force. Now again, of course, the records being highly secretive might mean that there were considerably larger Imperial forces involved in the cleansing, but that would be speculations. And now that I said that, I am immediately going to do a little bit of speculation. I suspect that this sector was chosen to be an example. Simple as that. The High Lord wished to make it very, very clear to anyone else that wished to perhaps abscond from the Imperium that such a thing would not be tolerated. Which leads me to further believe that mayhaps this was not a chaos incursion at all. Perhaps the entire sector, over the course of God only knows how many millennia, had slowly but surely started to drift away from the Imperium, until finally it figured that maybe, just maybe, it could get away with seceding entirely from the Imperium. Now, an entire sector seceding at once is rare, obviously, but it is not unheard of, and secessionist actions are most definitively not an unheard of action within the Imperium in of itself. Now, usually this is on a far smaller scale, 1 or 2 planets, a solar system perhaps, not an entire sector. But of course, it's important to remember that the Imperium of a Man is a very, very sucky place to live. And as such, if secessionist sympathies are allowed to take root and grow unopposed, it is far from impossible that an entire sector might flip practically overnight. It is also, of course, entirely possible that the sector might have been engulfed in intersign warfare for decades, or even possibly centuries or millennia, because, frankly speaking, the Imperium as a whole will rarely dispatch troops internally unless it is absolutely necessary. The area might simply have been embroiled in a quote-unquote civil war for a very long period of time, with the Imperium simply being too busy dealing with other things to send large-scale forces to deal with this sector. But whilst, of course, that may be the case, the High Lords could not possibly accept that a portion of the Imperium succeeded without consequences. That would send entirely the wrong signal. And considering again the fact that an entire sector had seceded, they might simply have thought, well, okay, we could reconquer this area, but clearly secessionist sympathies run very, very, very deep and very, very broad, which means that even if we did reconquer it, we would need to guard and garrison it probably for thousands of years. The cost would be astronomical, and we simply cannot afford it. However, If we send in 5 particularly zealous and loyal Space Marine chapters to cleanse the sector, well, the unfortunate truth is that repopulation is a hell of a lot cheaper than repatriation. This was not the first time, nor would it be the last time, that the Imperium would simply just wipe an area of space clean to then repopulate it later. Granted, it is occasionally fairly hard to get people that are willing to actually do stuff like this, as we are talking about the cold-blooded murder of hundreds of billions of people here, but, well, the Firehawks were more than willing to help out with the cleaning process. And considering the fact that most of these worlds were already entirely condemned, they didn't have to bother with lengthy military campaigns. All they had to do was achieve void superiority, and then dump virus bombs onto the planet below. Now, a virus strike is obviously rather devastating. The initial attack by the virus bombs will turn the vast majority of biological material on the planet into sludge. The subsequent attack by lance weapons will then ignite said sludge and cover the entire planet in a firestorm. The effects of this are obviously somewhat severe. The planet is going to be difficult to inhabit for a considerable period of time. However, it does not render the planet completely uninhabitable. Considerable resources are going to have to be expanded to make it livable again, but it can be made livable. This means that it is not the ultimate sanction of complete destruction like some exterminator sanctions can be. It's still not going to be a paradise world anytime soon, but at the very least you can live on it. And of course there's a certain poetic justice to wiping the planets clean with cleansing fire. The whole flesh-eating virus part is somewhat more controversial, but hey, we don't necessarily need to mention that now, do we? And it just so happens that the Firehawks were in a uniquely advantageous position to deliver the Emperor's cleansing flame. You see, during the Wars of Apostasy, the Firehawks had not gotten out of it entirely unscathed. Their original chapter homeworld of Zoros was destroyed by thermonuclear orbital bombardment unleashed by a fleet of the Ecclesiarches Frateris Templar. Rather fitting, really, that the Firehawks' homeworld got cleansed in nuclear fire. After the conflict, they were awarded with the Void-born fortress monastery Raptorus Rex, an absolutely massive station, comparable in size, although not quite as large, as the Imperial Fist's Phalanx fortress monastery. This allowed the Firehawks to bring plenty of virus bombs and the necessary detonations to cleanse the various planets within the Malagatine sector. It also meant that they would have a rather devastating void superiority. A space fortress of this size, of this weight, magnitude, and firepower, would be easily comparable to a Death Star, if not perhaps even bigger when it comes to fleet engagements. It would be absolutely bristling with bombardment weaponry and las batteries. Additionally, the sheer goddamn size of the thing means that it would be protected by literal kilometers of armored plating. Killing a void fortress is difficult, shall we say, and most certainly far, far beyond the capabilities of any sector-based planetary defense navy. Which basically means that the Raptorus Rex could simply just sail through the enemy's defenses and annihilate the planet below, before then quite happily mopping up whatever remained of the Voidborn defenses. Or in all due likelihood, whatever ships the sector was capable of mustering would see the monstrosity approaching, along with the combined naval forces of 5 Adeptus Astartes chapters, and happily fuck right the hell off. You would require a rather suicidal captain to even consider standing and fighting in the face of quite such a ridiculously unfair force. Considering the, in all due likelihood, overwhelmingly ridiculous advantage of the attacker in the great Malagatine purge, the casualties suffered by the 5 chapters, although unknown, were in all due likelihood extremely light. And after finishing the campaign, the Firehawks were once again rewarded for their zeal in carrying out orders that many would balk at, with the feudal world of Kostau 11 as their personal fiefdom. Now, being a feudal world means that it is a rather rough and tough place to live, which means in all due likelihood it would be a pretty damn good place for them to recruit new people. Now, of course, they still retained control over Raptorus Rex, and they would still be primarily a fleet-based chapter, but now at least they had a homeworld of their very own. A Space Marine chapter takes a certain pride of owning their own world, and indeed, some chapters even possess multiple recruiting worlds. And this is of course considered a high honor. However, the Firehawks' honor did also take a bit of a battering amongst other chapters and Imperial authorities for their willingness to commit mass genocide of hundreds of billions of what was once Imperial citizens. And again, this is one of the reasons why I suspect that the sector rebelled, not in a chaos sense, but in a secessionist sense, because if they were all chaos worshippers, nobody would have batted a goddamn eyelash. But the simple fact that the Firehawks' reputation suffered as a consequence suggests to me that this was not as clear-cut as the High Lords would have made it out to be. A suspicion that is once again aided by the simple fact that even the Inquisition does not have easy access to the records of the campaign, which suggests some pretty goddamn foul play. Combine that with the Firehawks' reputation for utilizing excessive force, or wait, no, excessive force does not even come close to describing what the Firehawks like utilizing. An apocalyptic display of overtly aggressive violence, brutality, and unnecessary cruelty is probably a better description of what the Firehawks like to consider battlefield tactics. Obviously, this gave the Firehawks a rather dark reputation, and it turns out that karma is indeed a bitch, even in the 41st millennium, as their brand new homeworld was swiftly destroyed, which returned them once again to being a fleet-born chapter, just in time, by the way, for the Badab War. Unlike the Lamenters, however, the Firehawks joined the war on the side of the Loyalists. Not particularly surprising, considering how much the Firehawks abhor any kind of secessionist thinking. However, originally they entered the war not because they were particularly suspicious of the Astral Claws, although they really did not like the Astral Claws. You see, the Astral Claws chapter master Huron had snubbed them during a previous campaign, which meant they were not too fond of them at all. You do not snub a Firehawk easily. These guys hold grudges for a very, very long time. And when it became clear that Imperial shipping was disappearing at a rather unfortunate rate in the Badab sector, they went to investigate. And the moment they had any inclination whatsoever to suggest that the Astral Claws might be behind it, well, let's just say that they were not at all averse to leaping to conclusions. This meant that they were one of the first Loyalist Astartes forces to get embroiled in the Badab War. This, unfortunately for them, also meant that they had to suffer the brunt of the fighting for a considerable amount of time before additional reinforcements could be sent in. The Firehawks dedicated practically the entirety of their chapter and their very, very considerable naval resources to the fight, but they had to, as I mentioned, fight practically solo for a considerable amount of time. This meant that during the early years of the conflict, they suffered considerable losses both in terms of starships and personnel, reducing the chapter's total strength to less than 22% by the third year of the war. At this point, the chapter was entirely retired from first and second line duty during what remained of the conflict and were relegated to support duties, until the final year of the war, when their chapter masters successfully lobbied the High Lords of Terror that at the very least the chapter's void-born fortress, Raptorus Rex, be given an active part in finishing the war, in the name of the Firehawks' honor. This was undoubtedly not a very hard request to grant, because, well, Raptorus Rex was hands down the single most powerful warship in the entire Maelstrom sector, and could then act as the linchpin of the final blockade against the Separatists. The war, of course, ended with an Imperial Loyalist victory. As mentioned in the Lamenters, this meant that the other Loyalist chapters on the secessionist side had to undergo penchant crusades, while considerable amounts of their war material were granted to the victors. Part of this was undoubtedly handed over to the Firehawks to rebuild their navy. And this is around about the time where the Firehawks got a really good idea. Or, well, to be fair, the really good idea occurred to them some 60 years later, but the really good idea was to invade the realm of Nurgle to free one of their captains, because, obviously, why wouldn't you? And while they were invading the literal immaterium, they burst into flames! Quite literally. Not in a horrifyingly burning to death screamy nonsense way, but actual ethereal flames covering their bodies that burned Nurgle's demons. Because why not? Which would now mean that they are quite literal Firehawks. Interestingly enough. It, unfortunately, did not extend to the captain they were rescuing, as he had been well and truly infected with Nurgle's rot, and had become a plague carrier for the Red Plague, which is always nice unless you want to, live in the material world at any point in time without killing an entire sector's worth of people. This predicament meant that the chapter dived back into the warp, trying to stop the plague from spreading, and they were considered lost in the warp. However, that might not necessarily be the case. There is in fact the possibility that they may be lost, quote-unquote, but not quite in the way that one might necessarily expect. In fact, it might appear as if the once proud Firehawks were finally shown a reason to be a bit more humble and to reflect upon previous actions, but that is a story for another day. Don't worry, I won't keep you suffering for too long. I will finish up the Cursed Founding with a potential story about the Firehawks. But until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.